All right. So I've been a firefighter for around about 20 years now, a bit over 20 years. I did 6 years as a volunteer before I joined up about 15 years ago as a career firefighter, and I've been doing that ever since. And in that time, I've done a whole range of different things that you'd normally do as a career firefighter. I've gone to a lot of urban fires and a lot of road accident rescues, and been to a lot of bushfires, and even done some remote area work. So I've, in that time, done and seen a bit, as you would for any firefighter that's done it for 20 or so years. But one of the other things that I've also done is a lot of urban fire behaviour instructing. So I've done a lot of urban instructing, and I've done that for almost 10 years or so now. And in that time, I've learned a lot, like a lot. And I've got some things right, and I've got some things wrong. But one thing I do know is that I've still got a lot to learn. There's still heaps that I would like to know that I haven't learnt yet. So there's always a lot more to know about this job, and I just don't think anybody's ever going to know it all. It's just not possible. There's simply too much to know. So always learning. And to that point, I'll probably bring up just quickly the Dunning-Kruger effect, if you've never heard of it. It's really interesting, and if you think about it in terms of firefighting, it's a really interesting concept, because what it is it looks at someone's confidence versus their competence. So as you learn a little bit, your confidence really skyrockets, and I think we've probably all been there, where you learn a little bit about firefighting and you're pretty confident in your knowledge, and you see it in the people when they tend to join. They'd learn a little bit, and then they become pretty sure they know it all, until such a point as they learn a little bit more and they realise that there's still a lot more to learn. So you see on this graph, you sort of see it where the little bit of knowledge lets their confidence really, really spike. And then once they start learning a little bit more, they've been in the job a little bit longer, their confidence starts to drop as their competence increases, because they're learning that there's all this stuff that they don't know. Whereas at the start, you don't know what you don't know, so the confidence goes up. But as you learn more, you start to become more aware of all the things that you don't know. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And I think for all of us, we've all been there, where the more you learn, the more you realise there's more to learn. And so that kind of brings me on to what I wanted to talk about today, because while I've been making this channel, I've learnt a lot. Each subject that I've done a deep dive into it beforehand to try and learn all I can to be able to deliver it in a straightforward manner. And in the processes, I've just learnt heaps. I've really learned a lot. And I've even challenged some of the things that I believed before I started making it along the way. So that's been pretty cool to sort of challenge some of the things that I came in with thinking, and even turned a couple of things on their heads. But most importantly is I've learned a lot, and it's been a really cool experience. But one of the things that I've learnt along the way has just left me with that "how did I not know it" feeling. When I first learnt about it, I was just like, how do I not know this? How have I not come across this before? And it's a really interesting concept, because it really plays into firefighter health and safety. Now, the concept itself probably isn't going to make you better on the fire ground, but it might save your life. So it's kind of one of those interesting things where probably not that useful on the fire ground, but for us as firefighters, it's actually pretty important to at least understand the concept behind it. And the concept itself is known as the equivalence ratio. Now, I could go ahead and just go, here it is on the screen, here's a definition, this is basically what it means, happy days, end of video. But what I'd like to do in this one is just kind of walk our way through it in a narrative to why this is actually important, and how the equivalence ratio keeps us safe, because it doesn't keep us safe, but the concept behind us can allow us to keep us safe. Because what it leads to is talking about the rise in firefighter cancers these days, and those kinds of health effects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and start at the start and just build up a bit of a narrative that goes through to talking about why this is so important, because I think without that narrative, it possibly doesn't have the same punch. And so you might not be able to see why I'm quite so passionate about really pointing out the importance of this and what it means to firefighters so that we can keep ourselves safe. So with that said, we're going to have a look at the fire triangle. Now, we know that fires need heat, fuel, and oxygen. That is our fire triangle. And if we think about this room right now, the fuel sources we have around on my table here, well, that's just a wooden table with some carpet on top to try and make the sound a little bit better. And between the wood and the carpet, we've got both a natural and a synthetic fuel source, or modern synthetic fuel source. Now, within those fuel sources, the synthetic ones we know are really rich hydrocarbons. So we've talked about them previously on the channel, and it's a pretty common narrative when you talk about firefighting these days, is that the information is certainly out there that modern synthetic materials are a big hazard for firefighters. But when we're talking about the components of smoke itself, it's really interesting to sort of dive into it a little deeper, because the hydrocarbons we're talking about in these fuels are hydrogen and carbon in really rich fuel sources. They're oil derived, so it's just a really rich, densely packed fuel source, which is why they make such interesting and difficult fuel sources in fires. But then when we look at natural materials, we're still looking at fuel sources that are built from hydrogen and carbon, and include things like nitrogen and various other things as well, just like our modern synthetic materials do. And so they've still got the same base elements to them, but they're just constructed in a different way, and there's different amounts, and there's a bit more to it. But essentially, a lot of the same stuff is still there. The same basic building blocks are still there, but they are built differently. But it is really important when we start thinking about it, because it's all there. And when we start talking about when fires are burning and pyrolysis, it comes back into play. So that's our fuel source. When we talk about oxygen, well, yeah, obviously, clearly oxygen in this room, 20.9%, breathing that right now. So we have more than enough oxygen for the fire right now. The final thing is heat. Now, in this room right now, it's Tassie in autumn, and it's getting a little bit cooler. I've got a heater just here, but I've got it turned off just because I don't need to have the extra noise in the video. So it's only about 13 degrees Celsius in this room at the moment, which, while it is a little cooler, it certainly still counts as heat. But when we're talking about heat, we're really talking about anything above minus 273 degrees Celsius, which is essentially where molecular motion stops. So we have heat in this room, but we don't have enough to have a fire. So if I went and got a blowtorch and put it onto my table here or onto the microphone, clearly that's going to add the heat that we need to fill in the sides of the fire triangle, get everything in the right proportions to each other, and then we're going to have fire. Because the fire triangle, yeah, we've got heat, fuel, and oxygen in this room right now, but we need those things to be in the right proportions to each other to be able to get fire. And that's a pretty important concept, when you actually have to have them in the right proportions, because if not, you don't have fire. So when we do add heat to our fuel sources, we're breaking them down and releasing the base elements, so hydrogen and carbon. And it's not as simple as that. It releases all kinds of stuff in different ways, but if we just keep it very simple, because I'm a firefighter, not a chemist, we're going to say that, it's going to release hydrogen and carbon, which then needs to be oxidized for a fire to exist. So that's our fuel sources. And that's what's happening in the pyrolysis process. We add heat to our fuel source. That starts to break down. It goes through the states of matter. So it goes from a solid, which is my microphone right now, the foam that makes up the little shroud here. Well, that's a solid. If I add heat to it, well, we know foam can melt, so that becomes a liquid. Add more heat to it again, and it starts to break down and become a gas. And that's what we know as pyrolysis gases. And those are the things that are actually burning in a flame. When we see a flame, what we are seeing is burning smoke. That's what flames are when we're talking about structure fires and all these sorts of things. Flames are burning smoke. It's burning pyrolysis gases. That's exactly what they're made of. All the yellow glowy bits, burning smoke. That's exactly what it is. And so it's just that oxidation process that's happening, and it happens to emit light and heat. So we've talked about our fuel, we've talked about the pyrolysis process, and the next thing I want to talk about is flammability range, because this one's a really important concept when we want to talk about the equivalence ratio. Now, we know that for a given flammable material, and I'm going to pick LPG or propane as an example, it's got a flammability range of around about 2 to 10%, which means that its lower explosive limit is at 2%. So at 2% LPG in this atmosphere right now, we would have made a flammable mixture. Below that, we've got LPG here, but it's not flammable. Once we get above 2%, then we're in a flammable mixture, and it will stay flammable all the way through till about 10%. And so once it reaches 10% and we go above it to 11, 12, 20, 30, 40, 50, we've simply got too much fuel for there to be combustion. So in that range between 2 and 10%, for every bit of fuel, we've got the right amount of oxygen or thereabouts sitting there to allow combustion to occur. But it's not quite that simple, because when we're having a look at a flammability range, somewhere between the lower and upper explosive limits, there will be an ideal mixture. And this ideal mixture is essentially when for every bit of fuel, we have the right amount of oxygen sitting there ready to go to oxidize those fuels. So we've got that perfect mixture at the ideal mixture where every bit of fuel has the right amount of oxygen all ready to go, and therefore we can get really efficient combustion, or at least in theory we can. And we see this in premixed flames. So for blowtorches or even barbecue cookers or those sorts of things, where you got a nice blue flame, what's happening is the air is being drawn in with fuel. It mixes around. There's the right amount of fuel for the right amount of air, and then we get really efficient combustion. And the general byproducts for a hydrocarbon fuel source off that will just be carbon dioxide and water. So the carbon is being fully oxidized to create carbon dioxide, and the hydrogen is being fully oxidized to create water. And so that's pretty good. Water and carbon dioxide are both non-toxic to humans. We create carbon dioxide when we're breathing, but if we only breathe that, we will suffocate. But it's essentially, they're not that bad for us in low levels. Whereas things change when we become underventilated. But to give you an idea, that's our ideal mixture, where we've got the right amount of fuel and the right amount of oxygen. Now, if we go above that, if we go to the 2%, that is where things become flammable for the first time. This is where we have just enough fuel to form a flammable mixture. But at this stage, we actually have an abundance of oxygen. Remembering that at 4% for LPG, that's where we've got the right mixture. That's where there's only just enough oxygen for the right amount of fuel, and therefore we can get efficient combustion. But at 2%, we've got lots of oxygen, an abundance of it, more than we need, and therefore the fuel can burn fairly efficiently as well in this stage. So between that 2 and 4% for LPG, then we can get reasonably efficient combustion. Remembering that diffusion flames are fairly inefficient things in themselves. So we'll still get products of incomplete combustion. They'll still get a heap of nasties off it. We'll just get less of it in comparison to later on. Because as we move closer and closer along the scale towards our ideal mixture, we're seeing less and less available oxygen until we reach that ideal mixture. And that's when, for every bit of fuel, we've still got every bit of oxygen that we need. Whereas when we go past that ideal mixture, we're moving past what we call the equivalence ratio of 1. So the ideal mixture gets a rating of 1 on our equivalence ratio, because at that rating, at that place, we've got for every bit of fuel, there's the right amount of oxygen. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Where when we move past that rating, now we're starting to move into a state where there's more fuel than there is oxygen to actually oxidize those fuels. And by that very nature, we must be getting more products of incomplete combustion once we move past that place, because there simply isn't enough oxygen anymore to allow efficient combustion to occur. And so once a fire becomes underventilated, once we move into a place where we have more fuel than we have oxygen, its very definition, we must be getting more products of incomplete combustion. And so if we have a look at an example like polyurethane foam, now this is a hydrocarbon, it has nitrogen in it, and so some of the byproducts, some of the common byproducts we will get by burning polyurethane foam will be Yes, you'll get some efficient combustion products like water and carbon dioxide, but you will also get carbon monoxide, carbon, hydrogen cyanide, benzene, and formaldehyde. Now, some of these things are really bad for us. Some of these things are carcinogenic. And so when we're talking about underventilated fires, we can see that once we become underventilated, the really nasty products really start to accumulate very quickly as we become more and more underventilated. And it's important to note that this isn't just modern synthetic materials that will do this, because natural materials will also produce more and more products of incomplete combustion once we move into an underventilated state. And so this is a real problem for firefighters, because as we are moving further and further into filling our homes with all these modern synthetic materials, which are very effective at creating underventilated fires, we are seeing heightened rates of cancer in firefighters as they are being exposed to these products of incomplete combustion. Now, when we're wearing BA and turnout gear and everything else that we should be wearing, we're reasonably well protected from these things. Our respiratory system is fairly well protected. Our digestive system is fairly well protected. Our skin is still being exposed to these things, which is why decontamination after going into these fires is just so important. You come out, and then as soon as practically achievable, I know it's not easy to do, but when as soon as practically achievable, get back to your station and have a shower. Get that stuff off your skin, because it's no good for you. You want to get it off your skin before it can get through your dermal layer and then get down further into your body, because it's accumulations of these things over time. Multiple fires can really start to create issues for firefighters. And so while one large exposure to smoke really can bring you unstuck, it's really not a good thing. You can also get this problem of multiple exposures over time, creating big health issues in firefighters. And it's kind of that theory of, one cigarette won't kill you, but a pack a day for quite a long time, well, that probably will. And it's the same thing with fires as we go to, is each time we get exposed to these things, it's a greater and greater risk that we're going to get these health issues. And so the way to counteract that is to make sure that we wear our BA properly. When we're coming out of a fire, we go through decontamination, we get the stuff off ourselves, we send our gear away to be cleaned, and then we make sure we go back and have a shower ourselves so that we can get all of that smoke and all of those different materials off our body, just to really sort of try and reduce our chances of having these health effects. Now, I've sort of focused on the chemicals a little bit, but there's not just chemicals that's important to think about here, because there's also other stuff that's called particulate matter, and it's just really, really fine products of soot, essentially. But it's so small, it's like 1/10 the size of a human hair, and it's small enough to get into your lungs, get into your bloodstream, and cause all kinds of problems. And it's not just carbon or soot. It can carry a whole heap of other chemicals with it that can be really, really bad for you. It can cause cardiovascular issues and heart attacks, but also like cancers and things as well. And while the chemicals like carbon monoxide and so forth can dissipate relatively quickly in the air, not super quick, it's still going to cause a problem with smoke plumes and those sorts of things. But the particulate matter can travel a really, really long way and cause health issues a long way down track. So it's really important that when we're working at these fires that we wear our BA, we decontaminate, and when we're outside as officers or pump operators or whatever you're going to be doing outside, make sure you're not working in the smoke, and always wear some sort of respiratory protection, whether it be a P2 dust mask or a respirator, or even BA if you have to. If you're going to be in the smoke, wear BA. Because at the end of the day, it's really important that we look after ourselves so that we can have long and happy and healthy careers. So I guess the point of this one is the equivalence ratio is possibly a bit of an obscure thing, but we know that between sort of that 0, where it's just flammable, and all the way up until 1, you're going to be getting more efficient combustion. But we know that pretty well the firefighting we do these days, because of so many of our fires are underventilated, we're going to be operating in that 1 and onwards kind of range, where we're going to be getting more and more products of incomplete combustion, and they're not good for us. And so it's a really important thing for us to understand, not so much the equivalence ratio, you don't really need to remember the term, but just know that these fires, they're no good for us. And, we're not going to stop going to them. We've still got to go and put them out, but we need to take steps to make sure that we can live long, happy and healthy lives and enjoy our careers and do a lot of good things. But to do that, we've got to be proactive, and it's a whole career of being proactive. And so if you have anyone sort of discouraging you from getting your gear cleaned or learning more about decon or learning more about fire, I'd probably say you're not doing the best thing by listening to them, because it really is about you, your health, and, your longevity. So I'd probably say learn all you can, be as proactive as you can, and you'll be the better for it. All right. Well, thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.